So I am going to start with a question. This is a panel that was actually formed in response to some things that Betsey talked about at Econ Ed last year that were really interesting. So I've asked her if she would just start by taking a minute to talk about why she thinks we see this underrepresentation of women and minorities. So I'm going to turn this over to her.
Yeah, there you go. Great. Well, thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be here talking about this issue. It's one that I personally care just an enormous amount about, and I'm really glad you had the data on minorities as well, because the article and Alice Wu's focus on a hostile environment towards women and the economic job market rumors website, and it's also actually there's really nasty comments in there about minorities as well, and it's just that there's so few that we don't talk about it enough, but actually that's the problem, is the really real lack of representation and of people of color in our classes from undergrad all the way up. And when it comes to women, you had this stat 30%, but I want to put that in the context of the fact that 60% of our college students are female. So we're not even, 50% is still an underrepresentation. So we really have a long way to go. And it really matters. So one of the things I was struck by most when I started working in the White House was all the people who give economic advice who aren't economists. And so there is competition for ideas out there. And when we drive people out of the field, when Justin talks about the lost souls, those lost souls go out and study other things. Those lost souls are, competing to give economic advice to public policymakers. And public policymakers want to hear from a diverse group of voices. So if we're not training women and minorities in economics, then they're going to be getting economic advice from women and minorities who studied something else. And so there is a real a loss, and I think I wasn't sure. I think last year I showed a photo of like a bunch of people who were economic advisors who didn't have any economics background. So we really lose out there when we don't have people, when we're not training enough people. And then there's also just, one of the things I studied was Title IX and how Title IX created all these opportunities for girls to play sports. Well, when you create these opportunities for girls to play sports, what happened? We identified loads and loads of talent, and that's why the U.S. does so well in women's sports at the Olympics, in international competitions. Like, why do we keep women winning the World Cup in soccer with the women's team, but can't do it with the boys, right? So when you go out there and you give opportunities equally to people regardless of gender or ethnicity or race, you identify the talent and you nurture the talent, and you do a better job. And we're failing that in economics. We are only looking at part of the pool. We're gonna have to open it up if we really want to find the talent.
And Betsey, let me stop because I realized I got out of order.
Oh.
Yeah. So I kind of asked the question I had next. So I did want to ask our panelists why they think this matters, and Betsey has certainly kind of talked about that in a broad sense. But I also wanted to ask him why you think it matters in our classrooms.
So I think that Betsey's absolutely right. So we're not going to have a lot of disagreement here like we did on the earlier panel. I think that if other people, other voices don't have a seat at the table, then we only hear from one perspective. And it's not an accurate reflection of the real world, the world that hopefully they're going to someday go out and work and live in. And so it's this very insulated environment that we create. And so they don't think of the problems that they hear about as being relevant to them, right? And then they go out and they don't see the value of econ. So if we want to show them the value of what we do, then we have to bring all the parties together, and we have to let everybody have a voice and a different opinion. If you ever get two economists in a room together, they're always going to disagree on something, but it's fascinating to me that we don't bring this into our classroom and show them all the different sides of econ, all the different colors and gender and so on, that we just don't bring that in. And so we end up with this kind of unified voice that's not an accurate reflection of what they go out to face. So that to me is the important piece, and to connect it across the entire spectrum of K-12, which is where Centers for Economics Education work, as well as into the classroom, and then take it out into their career. That's my personal motivation.
Kalina, what do you think about the econ major? Why does it matter within the major as a whole?
I mean, I think just we've kind of already hit on this idea that we need a variety of perspectives, a variety of life experiences, and if we're only getting one side of the story, then we're missing out on all of these other stories that have to be told. So I mean, I don't really think there's much more to add except that we need that variety of perspectives.
Betsey, did you want to go ahead and show us a little bit? So our next question, I wanted to ask Betsey a little bit about why she thinks the representation is fairly low. And the thing that I think is crucial about that, because last year she kind of led into a discussion of what we might actually do. And so I think that's what we want to figure out after that is kind of what can we do as economic educators.
So these are some of the questions that I've tried to look at to try to understand, do people of color, do they approach economics differently? Do they learn differently? Why are we not reaching them? So principals instructors do think that men and women learn differently. Like if you just ask them that as a yes/no question, it's pretty clear that they say yes, women learn differently. And that professors think that students learn by example. So when you ask them if they learn differently, you get a big difference. Almost everybody says yes. But then when you try to figure out how it is that they learn differently, you see that it's still the case that they think the majority of people learn through examples. And I think we saw some great discussion of that today. The presentation we saw about guns and butter was all about the rich ways you bring examples into the classroom, because we know our students really respond to things where they can grab onto the idea. You do see that people think women learn a little bit better by example, but what the real difference is they think that men learn better mathematically or graphically, whereas women learn better verbally. But I think it's still worth pointing out that the majority think that people learn by example. But now, notice, these are just professors' views. What happens if we turn to the students? And one of the things that we see is that there is a gender difference in students caring about whether it's interesting or whether it's going to have a great return on their investment. So guys are more willing to go into a field because they hear that the jobs that you get at the end of that field pay well. And economics, we have that going for us. Econ majors do earn more than a lot of other majors, so that's something that we have going for us, but that's something that's doing more to draw men into the field than to draw women into the field. Women, there's sort of two issues that this chart illustrates. One, women want to be intrinsically motivated. They want it to be interesting. And they also are terrified about their grades. And that is something research has actually shown, is that a woman walks in and takes principles, their very first econ course, and a guy walks in and takes principles. The woman gets a B, and she's like, oh, I guess econ's not for me. I'm just not very good at it, and she doesn't go on to take another econ course. The guy gets a B-, and he says, God, I had the worst professor, but I'm a genius economist. And he goes on, and he takes, another class. I just had an example of this. I decided this year I was going to be really proactive. So before the midterm, I looked at all the sort of, I do a lot of multiple choice questions with my students. Somebody was asking about assessment. I do a lot of multiple choice. I do clicker questions every single day in my class. And then so I'm assessing where they're at like every day. And I went through all these clicker questions. I went through their homeworks, and I saw where people were and identified my bottom 15 students. And then I hand emailed them and said, I'm worried for you. The midterm's coming. You're at the bottom of the class. I got emails back from every single guy telling me that I didn't know how smart he really was. And I was like, dude, okay, then your midterm will be great, but it's my job to warn you that you might want to study extra hard, go to office hours, But not a single woman told me that I didn't understand how smart she was. So there is this gender difference when it comes to grades. And I don't know what this is like in all of your universities, but econ sometimes does hold harsher grades and a harsher curve than, say, a lot of other majors like psychology that women might be drawn to. And I think we do have to think about, I'm not telling anybody to grade easy to get gender inclusivity, but I do think that you need to think about whether or not your grading policy is shaping what your majors look like. And I think that we don't see this actually though when it comes to differences between white students and non-white students. So there's really not I'm showing you this graph, but I actually sort of grappled with it because I think the thing to take out of it is that we don't really know what it is from these set of questions that would draw more non-white students into econ. What we see is that most of them just say, no, I wouldn't consider under any conditions. And so I think that brings us back to the question of, these are students who are, I should have said, are enrolled in a 101 class. So what is it that their experience has been like so far that means that they're not attracted to economics? And because it's not about it being interesting or too challenging or any of those kinds of things where we ask the questions. And so, I already talked about how women were slightly more motivated by interest in the subject. So, those surveys start to paint a picture, but I don't think that they really tell us the full thing. And one of the things they do that we've seen in the data is that it's not really about math. And I don't know if we were going to come to that or this is like the right
This might be the point.
point to sort of make this point. So I hear from a lot of people, well, the reason we don't have women, the reason that we don't have minorities is because they don't have the proper training in math, they're more math phobic, there's nothing we can do about that. So sort of put up their hands and say, it's the math that makes us less inclusive. Well, I have to tell you something, we are less inclusive than math. So you can't blame math when we're doing worse than math. So if it's the math, we should be able to do as well as they're doing. And to that point, one of the things I showed from last year that still sort of stuns me was that the University of Michigan, the math department, wasn't doing really well. And they were like, oh, we're going to solve that. And there was a guy who, it was just like, he was on a mission. He was going to redo the course until they had gender equity. And within 10 years, they got to gender equity because it was a mission, it was a belief, and he was going to make it happen. So one of the ways in which we're going to get more inclusivity into economics is we got to commit to this. We got to want it. And I participated in a panel yesterday on inequality, and one of the things someone said was, there's all sorts of subtle things that go on. And she was looking at performance evaluations at a tech company. And they found that in 2/3 of the performance evaluations of women, they talked about her personality. And in 1% of the evaluations of men, they talked about his personality. So you got to now think, like, there's a problem, and you got to address it. And that's, that idea that we have a problem in the way we talk about women in the field, the way we think about women in the field, we got to quantify that. We got to address it, and we have to have a commitment within our department to making change. And that commitment will percolate all the way down to what our 101 classroom looks like.
So some examples. Do you want to go ahead and click ahead for us?
Oh, sorry.
Let's see. So these are types you talked about. I don't know if you want to take just a second, and then Kalina and Kim had some good examples for us.
Yeah, well, we can start, this sort of builds off what you just heard from Justin talking about making economics more useful. One of the things I'm really committed to is my students are giving up a lot to be there, and I want them to learn something that's useful. And for it to be useful, I think that we can't treat them like they're children. And so I know how easy it is to give a pizza example, but what I want is to give them an example that actually helps connect them to the world and takes them seriously, because they want to be taken seriously. They're investing in themselves. So you need real-world examples related to well-known companies. I have actually, called companies and had discussions with them as we're trying to build out examples, because I think that when you can bring truth and real decision-making skills to students, they know how to use it. And one of the most exciting moments to me as a teacher is I had a student come back to me and he said, I called my dad and he was trying to decide whether to expand his business, and I was able to use all my tools from class to have a real discussion with him about the benefits and the costs of doing a business expansion. Making it useful, making it real world, and exploring a variety of industries. Guys do too much sports. I like sports, but guys do too much sports. We've got to talk about tourism, retail. You saw the industries that people go into. They're going to work in tourism, in retail, in restaurants. We need to focus on examples that resonate with both genders. We need to explore good decision-making in their roles, as Justin was saying earlier. And I know math is easy to test. I get tired too. I'm teaching a lot this semester. But it's really, really easy to forget. And we want to teach them tools that they can retain so that they can go on to the next level of economics, where we can layer onto their retention with a more formal framework. And those, and so we need to emphasize concepts and come up with ways to assess their learning that assesses not only what they memorized the night before, but what they're likely to retain.
Thank you. So Kim, could you give us some examples that you use?
So I love sports and do use a lot of sports. I'm guilty of that. But in the South, it kind of permeates across gender lines for us. You're either all in or you don't live there. And so I do use sports examples. I think probably the biggest thing that I do that's very intentional in terms of inclusion would be fixing things on my slides. And by that I mean that every single example that I have, when you go and you do a Google image search, you don't just pick the same race and the same gender every single time. And it's something that unless you're more sensitive to it, and so being a female and a minority in the South, I am more sensitive to it and pay attention to it. But making sure that the examples that I put in front of them are diverse. And you have to look at your slide deck as a whole and say, okay, do I have good representation here? Am I including everybody in the conversation? To me, that's step one in terms of the examples that you choose. I use a lot of more contemporary examples, a lot of music and media to try to draw the students in, and then also things that are relevant to them currently. So knowing your college-age students, it's going to be things like dating and drinking and going to the gym. Those are things that are important to them right now, but then they also are very entrepreneurial. And so what could they take into? They all want to own their own business. They're all going to be their own boss. And how can you bring in those examples and put minority entrepreneurs in front of them, bring in speakers and those sorts of things is a lot of what I concentrate on.
Kalina, I think you had some examples you were going to show us.
I do. I've got some slides. The first thing, kind of going off of what Kim said, is to vary up your examples. So I kind of view exam questions as just examples that we're not doing together, that they're doing on their own. Thank you. And so one thing that I try to do is on any questions that I give them on problem sets on exams, I try to vary up pronouns. He, she, vary up names, make sure that the names are, we've got multiple genders, we've got multiple races, ethnicities, and then I teach labor and gender and economics. And so we do a lot of household examples. And so with my couples, I always, unless I'm using well-known TV couples, which I do frequently, I try to pick gender-neutral names like Taylor and Sam so that they can read into it however they want, so that it's not an entirely heteronormative conversation about how spouses allocate resources and how they, division of labor between spouses. So I think it's important to just keep that in the forefront of your mind when you're writing questions, when you're doing examples in class. Are you talking about Billy and Sue all the time, or are you varying those examples? The other thing I wanted to touch on was making examples relevant to students. And I just, this goes right back to what Justin was saying earlier about comparative advantage. Your students are not the king of Portugal or England. They're making decisions. They're living with roommates for the first time and maybe having to do task allocation. So this is not a very, very real example because you can either wash dishes or bake pies. But it illustrates to them how you can use this principle of comparative advantage and gains from trade even within your new living situation. I also think that it's important to think about the topics that we're covering, and I think, again, Justin kind of hit on this in his slides as well, making economics useful. We need to talk about the topics that are useful and relevant to students' lives. And for me, one of those topics is externalities. Going back to what Betsey said about why students choose to major in economics, a lot of females, they want to be interested. They want to see the social implications, the policy implications of what we're learning. And I think with externalities, that's really important. So I try to use examples that might resonate with them, that they might have heard about recently. So global warming is a big thing right now, and has been for obviously a while. But I talk about negative externalities in production. Well, in producing beef for consumption, we're also creating greenhouse gases that lead to global warming. Students have to drive. They're buying gasoline. When they purchase gasoline and drive around, they're creating negative externalities. They're producing pollution, essentially, which, again, leads to global warming. And then we talk about positive externalities. I had somebody come in and talk about bees in my class this year and how we have a Save the Bees project going on at UNC. So we talked about the positive externalities from honey production, that bees can go around and pollinate crops. And then it was flu season, so hey, there are positive externalities when you get your flu shot. So everybody should go get your flu shot so you don't pass the flu on to other people and create, so that you're creating these positive externalities. Also using specific companies that they've heard of. So when we talk about externalities, I post an article in my note packet, and it links to an article about a sriracha production facility in California who, and the people in this town were experiencing burning eyes, burning skin every time they would be producing sriracha sauce. And that's, most kids are eating sriracha on something if they like spicy food. So they that resonates with them, I think. I think that's the last one I have for
So, they've given us some good examples to use in class. And I also asked, are there other strategies in terms of our teaching? So other things we do besides just the examples we choose and how we structure things that can be more inclusive. So I would throw this out to any of you. And then, Kalina, I guess you have one more slide you want to go ahead and talk about. Yeah, so I'll throw it out to Kalina first, actually.
So this kind of goes back to what I was just talking about with relevant examples, and especially with female students, they want to see the applications, they want to see how this, why they should care. And so I have my students in my 400-person principals class write 5 essay questions every semester. And again, I have a team of TAs and have discovered this amazing software, GradeScope, that helps grade all of these essay questions. But basically, they have to write a 1-page economic analysis, and hopefully maybe include some graphs to go along with it, similar to the Hall of Fame writing assignment that was talked about yesterday. But trying to pick topics that are going to resonate with a variety of students. So we just did one about trophy hunting. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? How should we think about trophy hunting? Will President Trump be able to achieve the 3% GDP growth he claims? Are price gouging laws a good idea after a hurricane? So basically, I'm just going to the current, the Washington Post or the New York Times or NPR, trying to find news stories that are current, or I use a lot of Planet Money podcasts, and just having them listen to a podcast, read an article, and then try to analyze it using the concepts that we're talking about in class and trying to make it relevant to them, so that they can see how these concepts play out in their everyday lives.
Kim, anything else you would add?
I would say in terms of classroom management, so people tend to self-select into their own segregated groups. That's where they sit. When they choose groups, that's who they choose to be with. And so I approach that classroom space as we do a lot of speed dating, and I mix you up in lots of different ways. Sometimes I switch them around by majors. I teach an interdisciplinary personal finance course, and so I will go through, and it's time consuming. I'll go through the roster and look at the pictures that are associated with them in our management system and purposely put different groups of people together. Different by major, different by gender, different by race. This semester I'm teaching a ton of athletes, so they can't all be on the same team, and put them together very strategically and make them work together. And then the next day, maybe we sort randomly, and the next day, maybe we pair up, and so on. And so that by the time they get to their semester end project, which is still Rockonomics, then they have a better sense of who the people are in the classroom because they've had to get to know each other. And I think it's important when we set up groups to make sure that we don't default to the person who has the loudest voice as the group leader, that we don't put a female in a purely secretarial role in the group. It happens all the time. We can do more than take notes and be your hospitality person. Like, we actually can do more and have more gifts than that. And so, but students default to their norm, and we do too. And I think one of the biggest things we can take into our classroom is to admit that the problem could be us. That it's not just that students learn differently, and so I can't teach that person because they're not good at math. Well, maybe you need to address being a better teacher. And I think it's hard to do because we think that we're God in our own classrooms. But I think that's when we move from just talking about it to doing something, is admitting that it could be us and we have the power, to change the way that we teach.
So I agree with everything you guys have said. And I think to add on what you were just saying, I think we need to think much harder about what it is that we're saying in the classroom. We need to think about our language, and we need to think about our words. And I think economists have too frequently given ourselves a free pass because we say, oh, we're describing positive economics, so just describing the world, so I have no responsibility for what those words are that I'm using. But Justin, this was like a really pivotal moment for me when Justin described how his sister-in-law was lost in economics. And when she told us, she just, that was almost 20 years ago when I first met her, and she's like, I can't stand economics. I don't understand all this rational, greedy behavior. It doesn't describe my life, and I don't want anything to do with it. I thought, that's a problem, because economics is not just for greedy people. Economics is not just for hyper-rational people. And that's what she took away. And that was a problem of the language that her professors use. And we've seen this in the studies. You guys have seen the studies where they come in, good people taking economics, and then we survey them afterwards, and they make poorer decisions. They're more likely to keep a wallet they find on the street because somehow they took away from our positive description of economics that they should be selfish. Well, that we're losing people because some people, they have a different set of values and they think we're telling them something. So I'm much more purposeful in how I talk to my students. When I describe externalities, I'm very careful not to say you only care about yourself, because some people actually care about other people. I say what we observe in the world is people tend to put a smaller weight on other people than they put on themselves. Right? That is a better description of what we observe in the world, and it means that I didn't just tell you, if you're not totally selfish, you don't belong in this room. There are other ways in which we can think about our language. I think most of you are probably at schools that have some sort of diversity, equity, and inclusion effort going on, and you've probably heard from the people who are pushing this the importance of the historical and cultural context under which we're discussing things. And I want you to know that goes as much for economics as it goes for any other field. You know, an example someone gave me yesterday was, how can you talk about school suspensions of elementary school kids in urban minority school districts without thinking about it in a cultural and historical context, which has seen children of color as potential criminals, right? And we as economists, we always fail on that domain. And I think being more conscious of the language we're using, and I'll just end by saying, you know, I looked up on my slides. I've been teaching public finance for a very long time. I was using some slides. I update them, but I had a wording on my slide that must have been 10 years old. And I was teaching Tibu, and it said, with Tibu sorting, you can end up with the problem of the poor chasing the rich. And I looked at that and I thought, oh my God, I just lost 10 people in this room who think like, and it's not that, yes, Tibu does describe a world in which you want the poor to sort from the rich, but that language of the problem of the poor chasing the rich, that turns off a lot of our students. We need to explain up front. You know, Tibu tells us to think about competition and how competition might allocate public goods appropriately, but it doesn't, you know, we need to discuss the distributional consequences before we lose them, is essentially what I'm saying. And it's something that I try to think about every single day. Am I going to lose my students with my words or not?
Well, so Betsey, last year you talked a little bit about implicit bias, and I mean, I think this is the perfect seg into that. I mean, would you say this is reflecting?
I think that's a really good. I mean, this is what we know about bias is that we've done a lot to eradicate explicit bias, and we've done almost nothing to eradicate implicit bias. And for those of you guys who are not well educated in that, implicit bias is, you know, when you just react differently without really recognizing why to somebody based on their color, gender, or race, or ethnicity. And that, our classrooms are rife with that. And we have to do more. It's our responsibility at the front of that classroom to deal with implicit bias. And Kim's doing that by sorting her students around and trying to
change their set of
experiences.
Kalina, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first part about implicit bias is you have to recognize that it exists before you can start to combat it. And I think a lot of people are unwilling to say, maybe I have some sort of subconscious bias that I don't know about. If you ask people if they're, misogynistic or sexist or racist, they're going to say no. But that doesn't mean that we don't treat people differently based on their gender, based on their race, based on a bunch of other characteristics without knowing it. And so I think it's important to first acknowledge that there might be a problem and just try to think about, are you doing everything that you can, or are you doing even small things? Like, let's just take baby steps. Are you thinking about the fact that there might be that you might have some implicit bias? And try to think of strategies to avoid that. So one thing that I do is I try to grade everything blindly. I have my students put their student ID numbers on everything that they turn in, and try never to look at names, so that who is turning in that assignment does not affect how I am grading it. And for me, that's more about, because I think that I might have preconceived notions about how smart someone is based on how they participate in class. But I think it also helps with just this idea that maybe I do treat my female students different than my male students, or my minority students different than my non-minority students. So I think acknowledging that it exists and trying to start thinking about small ways that we can address it as individuals, and then I think we also need to be having this conversation at the department level, because I think at the department level, or I think the profession in general has a little bit of a difficulty just acknowledging that we might even have explicit biases. And so, as the responses to the EJMR paper may have shown. So I think we need to start thinking more critically as a profession about how we want to deal with both implicit and explicit bias.
Kim, did you want to add anything on this one?
I would just agree that at the departmental, college, and university level, particularly for females who often are in roles like myself in a teaching track position, that student evaluations are a big part of our merit. And we know there's data out there that shows that we're biased against. I have student evaluations that say, you should dress better. And I'm like, I'm doing the best I can. Like this is, but that is not on my male colleagues' student evaluations, or having to deal with conflicts in the classroom when someone believes that you don't know your topic because you happen to be a female standing in front of you. And this comes out in merit, which then translates into pay and the other job opportunities that are put in front of us. And I think it has very real effects when you're challenged in the classroom. And there are things that my male colleagues have said, well, you should just say this, or that never happens to me. And sometimes we have to kind of look in the mirror and say, okay, well, could this be some explicit bias that's going on? And then once we recognize it, are we going to do anything about it, or just say, well, that's too bad? You should just work a little bit harder,
Kim, this is such an important point, and it was part of when I gave the example about, companies are grappling with this right now, and they're saying, people describe women as with the B word too much in their performance evaluations. Maybe we need to redact these kind of things, or we need to figure out how to adjust the evaluations. We know this about teaching evaluations, and I don't know any school out there that is actively figuring out how they need to renorm evaluations in a way that allow women to be compared, to allow apples to apples comparisons. And you also brought up the other problem, which is you have this credibility problem that women have to get through that their male colleagues don't. And I did have a dean. I was working with the deans of a bunch of business schools to try to build inclusivity when I was working in the White House. And one of the deans said to me, I think the problem is that we promote and give people raises based on evaluations, and the students, those evaluations themselves are biased. And so he raised this, but I don't think anyone's actually tackled it. But it can be done. Corporations all over America are doing it. It's time for the universities to do it.
I agree.
Panelists, is there anything else you wanted to add before we see if the audience has any questions?
I think I would add that just as growing up as somebody who is always different, right? Being the only minority in my school, I live in a town where it's less than 1% Asian, which means it's just me. And when I think about that, I think that often I read something recently that said, your differences are not a disability. And I think we've got to learn to embrace all the things that make us special, all the things that make us different, and share that with our students so that they see that somebody like them can make it too. And that's why you've got to put those examples in your class. You've got to bring in somebody from the outside business world who looks like them. And we just don't do it enough. And that idea of, it's not just that it makes me special, it makes me unique to be able to speak on this particular topic, and whatever makes you special, it makes you unique, and bring your own perspective. I think that's important to share over and over and over with our students, in our committee meetings, with our deans and so on, that it's not a hindrance. It doesn't keep us from learning econ and so on.
Anyone else?
I would just like, I think, to challenge everybody to think about, if they are doing anything in their classrooms to address some of these issues that we've brought up today, and maybe start to think about making one small change this semester, maybe another small change next semester, because we have to start, somewhere, and I think small changes are where we should go.